Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Tech Show. I'm your host, John Myer. And this week-long series is where we're hearing from public cloud leaders and experts on multi-cloud. Is it worth it? What is it? Can enterprise companies really successfully implement multiple cloud solutions? Should it be a bottom-up approach and not a top-down? Now, if you're interested in listening to other public cloud leaders on multi-cloud or digital transformation, take a look up here. And you want to stick around because you're going to want to hear what they have to say on multi-cloud and is it really worth it? In our previous episode, we used Google's definition of multi-cloud. Multi-cloud is the use of multiple cloud computing and storage services in a single architecture. This also refers to the distribution of cloud assets, software applications across several cloud hosting environments. Now, today we're taming the cloud, or in this case, multiple clouds with an expert cloud tamer around their thoughts on multi-cloud. But before we bring our next guest on, how about you click that like, subscribe, and notification button because we have more content on the way. Now, how about we hear from public cloud experts and leaders around their thoughts on multi-cloud? Join us today is CEO and co-founder of Cloud Tamer, Brian Price. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, John, no, great to be here. Congrats on the new role. Really excited to talk about today's topic.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it. The new role's doing awesome. Real quick, would you mind giving the audience a little backstory on yourself and Cloud Tamer before we jump into our current topic of multi-cloud?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Brian Price, co-founder, CEO here at Cloud Tamer. My background actually came up in the software development ranks, hands-on, got exposed to cloud in the early days. You know, I can't believe it's been, I think, 15 years since AWS kind of came on the scene and, got a chance to experience what it was like to, even in the very early days of a large company I was a part of, trying to manage and just control their cloud environment and enable developers to have, access, but not, too much access that kind of causes them to kind of fall out of compliance and standards. So, since that point, we've gone off and, built out Cloud Tamer. And what Cloud Tamer does is we're a software company. We help customers basically grow and control their overall cloud environment, being able to provide kind of the key governance and management capabilities that most organizations need, especially in a multi-cloud world, which is where we're going to be focusing a lot of today's kind of conversation. So we help, with areas around financial management, automation, orchestration, and ultimately security and compliance, and bring all of those into a single pane of glass to help organizations make better decisions and grow their cloud accordingly.
So, Brian, you touched on a couple of questions really that I'm going to have today from security, compliance, governance with multiple cloud. But before I get to that, excuse me, I'd like to understand what is your thoughts on multi-cloud or your definition around multi-cloud?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the very truest literal definition, right, it's using more than one cloud provider, right? But I think that the unfortunate, I'd say, perception differences that we see is some organizations think multi-cloud literally means I can take and run all their workloads in any of the cloud providers, and there isn't a functional or other broader impact. And I think that's kind of unfortunately, just a wrong view of that. The cloud providers themselves have got amazing services that you can build on top of, and those services unlock innovation in organizations. And so from a multi-cloud perspective, the way I always like to kind of think about it, it really just means there's options for customers to be able to use the best technology, the best platform for their specific needs, maybe even for their specific application needs. And I think under that lens, organizations can be very successfully implementing multi-cloud. Now, maybe to go to the next level here, but I do think, to do that effectively, there is some management concerns that you have to keep in mind. AWS is very different than Azure. It's very different than Google. And you need to make sure you kind of keep all of that in context and, make sure that at the same time, you're not putting kind of your hands behind your back, when it comes to developer innovation, if there are some very specific services that would allow a specific team or a specific, project to move further, faster in the cloud.
Brian, you mentioned a very key conversation I was talking with the CTO advisor yesterday for a recording on multi-cloud. By the way, folks, take a look up here if you want to see that recording. But also, he touched on and talked about people are selecting multiple cloud environments not for the right reasons, and meaning that they're afraid of maybe vendor lock or trying to save or trying to utilize more cost savings in it. But they're not using the services that are available. You should be selecting maybe a multi-cloud based off the services. And you just mentioned it. Some of those key services that people select, you have the best technology, and not one cloud provider provides it all and encompass. And that might be the reason that you're using, a multiple cloud environment. The other thing you touched on was the security aspect. Now, knowing what Cloud Tamer does, I'm curious if you've seen or have helped with a multi-cloud implementation on security and governance controls.
Completely. I mean, and that's, I would say, what a lot of our customers really come to us with. And it's, really around, making sure that in some cases they've maybe made an investment early on in AWS, right? Because AWS was around earlier and, has such a large market share, right? And they're looking at now enabling, say, some Google Cloud services for, again, very specific, kind of purpose-built workloads. And in that process, what they want to make sure is there is a consistency for their organization, right, in terms of how they go about, getting into the cloud, how the enterprise experience of using the cloud really works, right? And so from a security and governance and compliance perspective, what we try to do is kind of boil all of those into, kind of these common rule sets, common engines. We call them cloud rules inside of Cloudtamer.io. And the idea behind it really is that, a cloud rule can consist of an AWS IAM policy. It can consist of, Google as well, their equivalent. It can consist of a cloud formation template to set up infrastructure in a predefined way. It could also at that same time consist of, say, like a deployment manager template in Google or, ARM template in Azure, right? And all of that gets kind of bundled together so that, at the end of the day, there is a consistent approach across the cloud providers based on what service and what provider is being used for a specific application. And that's really where there's a huge amount of power, I think, that we find a lot of our customers to be able to go from, an AWS shop, into being able to support a multi-cloud environment that's going to give a department or, a new project some real innovation potential, right? And I think, today, the customers that we support, we rarely see, a customer saying, I am 100% all into a single cloud provider. They may be 95% into a cloud provider, but there's still that little piece that usually is available for, again, different teams that maybe have those requirements, but not allowing those teams to potentially compromise the overall security of the overall cloud environment.
And before I touch on the different teams, because I have a question around teams and those skill sets, you mentioned security. And speaking of that, what about just at the providing access level to just the multiple cloud environments? And I'm talking just the console itself to deploy out services and utilize them. I know most of them or all of them support SSO integration, but how many of those cases do you really see local users still have access and are being utilized?
More than we should. And I think that that's one of those things where, in a perfect world, you have your root credentials, you have them locked up into a filing cabinet somewhere, maybe with MFA, hard MFA tokens, if, even in the old days of AWS, and you never kind of touch those. But there are still a lot of organizations that, and again, maybe they were just moving really quick or they just wanted to get something stood up in a very quick manner, but they still don't have everything kind of central connected to their SSO providers. And that's a big miss, right? Because at the end of the day, the last thing you want is a person, let's just say they leave an organization and there are these extra keys. Maybe it's access keys, maybe it's IAM users, maybe it's some other method, right? And they're just persisting in the environment without someone or something or some automation. And again, there's some great just cloud native tools that are out there that can help do these checks, but just to make sure that you don't have an unintentional risk of someone leaving the organization and not going through that kind of central point. One of the things that we also kind of advise is, again, if you're going to use a solution, like Cloudtamer, there's others that are out there as well, but, kind of use that approach if you can behind a central kind of access point into the environment that all begins to tie all your users into some sort of trusted identity. Like one of our customers, as an example, they have 3 different methods that they can ensure that people authenticate. So it can be username and password. It can be, with an RSA token, and then it can be, with, a smart card or HSPD 12, kind of card, right? And so each one of those institutes a different confidence level. And that confidence level then drives additional permissions of what that person can do. So if they're logging in, as an example, our application, right, and they're just with the username and password, they have kind of this read-only view of what's going on. If they log in with that next level of, kind of assurance that they're using MFA, right, then that gives them additional permissions. And so by kind of tying all that together, it really makes it so the kind of identity pieces of kind of the cloud, kind of cloud users getting in the environment becomes much more assured. And organizations can have a lot more confidence that if somebody leaves or you need to turn off access or something happens, right, you've got a central place to do that ties into everything else. When you need new users provisioned, it's not a separate process to go per cloud account and do that. And taking those types of routine tasks and automating them are super critical, especially in a multi-cloud world, because the last thing you want to do is have an AWS team, a Google team, an Azure team that all have to do the same types of actions every time a new person comes on board.
Okay, that actually touched on the next question I have with the multiple cloud and skill sets and security. I'm going to tie this question all together. Okay, so I'm utilizing a multiple cloud environment. Let me just take 2 clouds because having 4 different groups or whatever, AWS and Azure. All right. I have my 2, multi-cloud environments. Now I have a security policy for each one that is different because both clouds do not have the same type of policies. Well, guess what? What about the person behind the scenes configuring it? Do I need to hire now a security expert for AWS and a security expert for Azure? And then they all roll up to a main person, the CISO, who is going to governance and control those. Now, the question is having multiple skill sets, but now what about training multiple people, having double the amount of people, or having a generalist who is not an expert in all of it? I mean, that to me sounds like you're spending more money on people to manage it rather than utilizing the environment.
It certainly can, and again, there are some technologies that can help bridge the gap there. In some cases, as an example, we leverage underlying into our platform, a library called Cloud Custodian that begins to kind of bridge some of the checks that you can do across the environments into, kind of common YAML languages. And that can help, right? And there's, continued more support in that open source project to be able to do more and more. And, we're constantly contributing back to that too. But it definitely becomes an area where, depending on the amount of workloads and the criticality of those workloads, and that's why I think it, kind of bubbles into kind of maybe some broader security premises here, right? Is making sure that you do have the right experts, right? I do believe, and it's an approach that we even take internally, is you want to have some people with some specialties, right? But you also want to make sure that you don't, you can continue to cross train folks as well in your organization. We, as an example, we have a person that is very fluent in Azure, right, on our DevOps team, and is helping to continually build out more policies. And that's a very similar model that we would encourage a customer to do. If you've got a significant amount of support that you need to make for one platform, you need to invest in people to do that. But at the same time, that person is leveraging and being cross-trained, in AWS and other providers. The hard thing is, I think, at least what we've seen is, if you're trained in AWS, you can pick up Google, not super quick, but it's a little easier than Azure. Azure's just a little bit different, right? And I think that kind of getting that understanding in the environment is super important to make sure that you've got a team that is collectively working together, that brings together the right skill sets. And at the end of the day, you're right. You have to invest not only in the technology but the people that's going to help take you there.
So going off of that one, my question with regards to obviously your cross training. Now, personally, I started learning AWS first, and then I tried Azure, and I failed miserably at it because I couldn't understand, where to find things. And this was way back. And I don't want to date myself, but when Azure had the sliding and two different portals for the access certain applications and services, I find myself that I could not be an expert in Azure because I was engrossed in AWS. Before I ask you our last question at the end of here, because I want to make sure that we get your perspective on multi-cloud. Going with that, are we creating a new role here? Maybe like, I don't want to say a jack of all trades, but a jack of all clouds, and that they're the governance to the expert architects of those clouds, or?
Yeah, I think we are, and I think that the organizations that we are supporting are starting to kind of form around this. So I'll give you an example here. Before we had this kind of I'd say a financial team or a security team, and then you add the multi-cloud view of that, and then there's some experts in each one of those. I think that that there is a concept where a lot of organizations are really trying to move their cloud, used to be CCOE, Cloud Center of Excellence, right, into this concept of the Cloud Center of Enablement. Actually, one of our customers coined that. So I have a little bit of credit for that. But the idea is that those jack of all trades, right, with some specialty skills, right, in some individuals, become this central point where at the end of the day, their job is to enable the organization to get the resources they need to build the applications they need to get the security, infrastructure applied in the accounts, to get the financial boundaries and guardrails in place to make sure the end-to-end automation happens. So the experience, right, for the user, for the end user, for that developer is, as simple as I'm requesting a brand new cloud account as a sandbox account to try things out, and it shows up in a matter of minutes, right? It's something that's available, very frictionless, very quick. And that is really what we find is again, to try to get to unlock true innovation, that's what kind of makes that work. And having those folks that are very universal across that is extremely important, that are always kind of keeping that eye on enablement, not traditional, security seen as the group that says, that kind of slaps your wrist and says, no, you can't do it.
So my next question, well, you actually mentioned silos. All right. And I remember in the data center world, and that's where I come from, server admins, Active Directory admins, network admins, database admins, and everybody had to figure the next person, the next hop to talk to. And you always blamed it on the network because it was the common denominator between everything. I do think those are going away. There was a point where, cross training was a huge thing. I need you to learn, Windows and Linux and a cross training. That was much easier than learning Azure and AWS, in my opinion. The commands and everything to kind of go off of, they were really a little bit easier to do. But is it worth it for the cost aspect to run multiple clouds with multiple people with different skill sets? I mean, you really have to do this as a bottom-up approach, in my opinion. You have to talk to people like those who are willing to learn multiple clouds. You're going to have an AWS guy that says, yeah, sure, I'll learn Azure. They're not going to. Is it really worth it from a cost, not only from a cloud services, but from a skill set to a company?
Well, here's the thing I will say. It typically makes the most sense to focus, to not spread this as a 33% spread across providers, right? Or even 50-50 in a lot of senses. It doesn't make a lot of sense there. Usually there's economies of scale that you get by simply investing more into one provider than another, right? You know, AWS has their enterprise discount programs.
Yep.
You know, Azure has, you know, a number of things used to be under their kind of enterprise agreements, and now they've kind of reformed those. But there are some good degrees of just volume savings that you can get that in most cases will far outperform in terms of cost, you know, the ability to just have, you know, just an equal spread again. And that's where, you know, I go back to one of the first things around trying to make sure that you're looking at what is going to enable your team and mission and projects to go further faster, right? And, you know, that's where that total cost kind of comes into play. So, you know, as an example, you know, if you don't have the experts, it's going to take a long time to kind of train them in a certain provider. So yeah, I definitely think that, you know, multi-cloud in, you know, that, you know, I can go from one provider to the next provider and move an application and things like that. That's you know, I think it's a flawed view of thinking, especially in 2021, where we're starting to see a lot of organizations, you know, just really see great economies of scale. You're seeing all the time people sign up for big organizations, say, hey, we're moving from the data center, we're moving, you know, 90, 80, 70%, whatever those workloads from, you know, data center into the cloud. And we've standardized on one provider because it's going to help us to do that, right? When you start to think about potential data transfer costs from one provider to another, those things have to be considered in the upfront decision-making process, because that is expensive. It is no cost to throw your money or throw your data in the cloud, right? It is very expensive to pull that back out or to pull it between cloud people, even pull it between regions, right? And that's where, you know, engineering is so important to kind of think through what is the use case for the application. You know, what is the services that's going to really help us, you know, move, you know, really move further forward. And, you know, in some cases, you know, maybe there is a less optimal service, but the data exists in one provider. We should probably use that provider because of the overall total cost, you know, of ownership of that application.
I think data transfer is something that's not considered right away. Everybody's like, all right, let's put it in there. We're going to access it. And then all of a sudden they're using multiple clouds. And guess what? They're accessing petabytes of data and realizing that their cost did not come from the services. It came from the data traversing not only cloud providers, but regions. I mean, that's actually a huge amount of cost. And when you go in there for cost optimization, you're looking at like, can we center this into a region? Can you move all the stuff here? The cost that you're spending on those services does not even come close to the cost you're spending on data transfer between those applications and those services.
No, completely agree. And again, like you said, it is something that gets very overlooked very quickly. And until it's too late. You know, again, we have the benefit of working with some really large government and commercial organizations. And, you know, when they're, you know, kind of thinking about this problem, you know, one of those, you know, basically made a decision 5 years ago, and they were, you know, in the process of, you know, basically building this giant data lake. And they basically said, you know what, we are doing all of that in AWS, and therefore, you know, for them, again, going back to that footprint, like 90% of where their costs are in AWS, because that's where their data is, right? And that taking into account that, you know, again, they're constantly adding more and more data from different sensors and different devices that, you know, on a daily basis are, you know, adding, you know, in some cases, petabytes of data. Like that is, you cannot ignore that part of the architecture and think that, okay, well, you know, that has to be just a big part of your considerations and how you're designing for what a multi-cloud approach looks like. And maybe in some cases it makes sense that it's easier to kind of fork some of the data off that you would want to use, you know, a service that maybe it hasn't, you know, there is an equivalent in AWS or it's not an equivalent in Azure, and you want to push that into the other provider. But in some cases, it's better just to push the data there and do whatever work that you need to do there versus trying to make that completely fully integrated, right? And so again, that's where, you know, a lot of planning, a lot of engineering is super important to make sure that you don't go down a path that becomes very, very cost prohibitive very quickly.
I actually have a customer who has deployed duplicate environments in separate regions. so that the data did not traverse between them because it was cheaper to have the environments up and running separately than it was cheaper to transfer the cost. Brian, my last question for you, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. What is your recommendation for companies that want to go multi-cloud? I know it's not a cut and dry, but what recommendation would you give to somebody or an enterprise says, we're thinking about going multi-cloud?
Yeah, and I think that at the core of it is don't go multi-cloud to avoid, as we've talked about, I think so far here, to avoid quote, quote, vendor lock-in. The reality is you're going to be locked into a vendor for a specific type of service, right? There is a tremendous amount of innovation that organizations can see and realize by using the higher level managed services in each provider, right? You want to turn on, AWS recognition it kind of unlock some AI and ML services. Well, that's great. And that's an easy button, right, to be able to do that. Don't expect the equivalent service to exist in every single other cloud provider, or vice versa. Like those types of things, I think that you really have to consider what it is that you're doing, and go into it with a very open mind. Don't rush into that decision. Think through what it is that you're going to be doing. And then again, I personally love the idea of using multi-cloud from a view of what's going to help you go faster, what's going to help you build the services that you need to get your organization, to get your applications, to get, in some cases, if you're completely digitally transforming your business and doing some giant moves to unlock the power of all the data that you have to think through that and where that data lives, where your users are going to be the most comfortable, familiar, what your training plan is to get there, and then kind of look at all of that and say, okay, well, what makes the most sense? And typically standardizing the majority on one with some other smaller purpose-built applications to help get the rest of the way there, and give that option, for your team to move forward. So that's kind of my recommendation.
Brian, you're echoing some of the same thoughts as my previous guest. That's really interesting to hear them. All right, everybody, remember this is a week-long series on multi-cloud with public cloud leaders and experts. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, the notification. I have more content on the way. Brian, thank you so much for joining me for the show, and I look forward to doing more in the future.
John, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yep, have a good one.